On September 17, 1984, my new government was sworn in, and Multiculturalism Minister Jack Murtagh announced publicly that we would be proceeding with a formal apology to Japanese Canadians for their mistreatment during the war. In an editorial the next day, the Globe and Mail stated, "One could scarcely have asked for a more satisfying start by the new Conservative government than a sign of willingness to try to clean up an old stain on the national character. It's not easy," they continued, "it's not easy to understand why the government of Pierre Trudeau made heavy weather of so obvious an obligation. The demands of common decency are at last being met," unquote. 4 years later, following intensive consultation and negotiation with the community, as Art Miki and others will remember, I entered the House of Commons to formally announce an apology and measures of redress. The House was hushed and emotions were high as I rose to speak. Perhaps the most significant element of this redress, I said, is the official acknowledgement of the wrongs of the 1940s. But redress must go beyond words and laws, important as they are for our present understanding and our future actions. No amount of money can right the wrong, undo the harm, or heal the wounds. But it is symbolic of our determination to address this issue, not only in a moral sense, but also in a tangible way. In that spirit, we will accept applications for the granting of Canadian citizenship immediately to eligible persons of Japanese ancestry still living who were expelled from Canada or had their citizenship illegally revoked during those years. We will accept requests for the clearing of names of eligible persons of Japanese ancestry who were convicted of violations under the War Measures Act and the National Emergency Transitional Powers Act. As well, in commemoration of all those who suffered injustices, we will establish a Canadian Race Relations Foundation to foster racial harmony and cross-cultural understanding, which gave rise indirectly to what we see around us here tonight. Mr. Speaker, I said, the treatment of Japanese Canadians in wartime was not only unjustified on moral and legal grounds, it went against the grain of Canada itself. We are a pluralistic society. We respect one another's language, opinion, and religious beliefs. We celebrate our linguistic duality and our multicultural diversity. We rejoice in the strengths of our regions, in the knowledge that they strengthen the whole. We are essentially a tolerant people, living in freedom in an abundant land. This is the Canada which our forebears worked to build, and that is the Canada all of us want to leave our children. As inadequate as apologies are, they are the only way we can cleanse the past so that we may, in good conscience, face the future. Mr. Speaker, I know I speak for members of all sides of the House in offering today to Japanese Canadians the formal and genuine apology of this Parliament for those past injustices and our solemn commitment to Canadians of every origin that they will never, ever be repeated again. As I concluded my remarks and took my seat that day, I remember looking up at the galleries in front of me, the visitors' gallery on the left and to the right. And I looked up at the galleries overflowing with elderly Japanese Canadians, many in tears, with their families. And I saw an outpouring of raw emotion from a group of loyal Canadians whose reputations and honor had been tarnished and besmirched by a government that had led Canada from that very chamber almost 50 years earlier. I remember talking with someone who was here, Charlie McMillan, who was married to a beautiful Japanese woman, and we talked on the way out of the house about what had just taken place. And I want to tell you something else. Robin Sears, who is here tonight, whose grandfather, in 1939, 40, and 41, and 42, his grandfather was a CCF member of the British Columbia legislature. And he was the only member of that legislature, as I recall, to have fought openly against the War Measures Act and against this terrible injustice towards the Japanese Canadians. And Robin and his wife, Robin, are with us here tonight. And I think it's wonderful that that tradition was maintained. After the apology and the announcement of the $300 million compensation package that we'd negotiated with the Canadian Association of Japanese Canadians, I received a poignant private letter from His Eminence Cardinal Carter, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Toronto. He wrote, "At this moment, I wish to address you, not to offer advice, nor to point out an obligation, but to commend you most highly as a humble citizen of this country for your historical gesture to our Japanese fellow countrymen. For better or for worse," the Cardinal wrote, "I was old enough at the time of the events to be very conscious of them. And while I understood the distress and the war hysteria under which we all labored, even at that juncture, I felt a great hurt and a deep sadness. If ever there was a collective miscarriage of justice and a condemning of persons without proof as guilty, this was it. I love my country," he concluded. "I have seldom been ashamed of her, and this one exception is now expunged by your gracious and timely intervention. I speak for no one but myself, but I am convinced that my sentiments reflect a consensus, particularly of those who were alive and grown up at the time of this unfortunate lapse from grace and judgment by Canada." So, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to the Japanese Canadians in wartime must never be allowed to happen again in this country, which is why my government then revoked the War Measures Act itself, the legal instrument that had enabled this odious decision to be implemented, and we replaced it with a much more sensitive and reasonable piece of legislation. What happened to 22,000 Canadians then was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of our country. What happened to them was that they lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings, and they were separated from their families and forcibly relocated either to camps or to parts of the country away from the West Coast. The Japanese Canadians lost everything except their dignity, their personal honor, and their tenacious sense that in spite of everything, this was their country.